So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Eastern West Learning Connections. I'm Yang Wang, your host and the president of this organization. We are a federally registered nonprofit organization. We bring learning, communicating, and volunteering opportunities to the public. And we want to help people of different heritages to break cultural barriers and get connected. Tonight, in collaboration with the Canadian Writers Union of Canada, we are thrilled to have three Italian Canadian writers to be our guest speakers. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I'd like to invite our co-host Shengnan Ma to read the land acknowledgement. Shengnan.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Wang Yang. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the land for Toronto today. So we acknowledge the land we're meeting on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Well, thank you very much, Shengnan, keeping us aware of the history and rights of Indigenous peoples. I think it is very meaningful because tonight, our guest speakers, our audience, and ourselves, coming from all our ancestors, coming from all over the world, and we gather here today to exchange our stories of immigration, our thoughts, our concerns, and with that awareness on our minds. Our guest speakers are three talented writers and scholars. Giovanna Riccio graduated from the University of Toronto, majoring in philosophy. And she is the author of several books, and her poems have been translated into Italian, Spanish, French, and Romanian. And she is the winner of the 2021 Venera Faccio Poetry Prize. Francesco Loriggio received his PhD from UCLA. He taught at the State University of New York, Albany, and then Carleton University, from which he retired as a professor emeritus. He is a scholar, a literature critic, a translator, and he has many publications in Canada, the US, Italy. He is the former president of the Canadian Association for Italian Studies, and he has also served many years for the National Congress of Italian Canadians and the Dante Alighieri Society. And Antonia Facciponte is a graduate student at the University of Toronto. She is also an author, and her poetry has appeared in many prominent literary magazines. And her first poetry book, To Make a Bridge, just was published by Black Moss Press recently. So welcome, Giovanna, Francesco, and Antonio. Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you very much, Yang, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, all of you, for attending this evening. I'm very grateful for that. I want to thank Yang and her team for hosting us this evening as well. So I'm going to try and cram a lot into this brief time I have to talk. But what I do want to do is get my story out, my story of immigration to Canada, and try to filter in as much as I can a couple of historical points that I'd like to make. So my name is Giovanna Riccio, and I immigrated to Canada in 1956 from Calabria. That is the southernmost region of Italy, also the poorest region of Italy, and it's right near the toe. I come from a small town. I was born in a small town called San Nicola da Crisa, and that town I would say, as far as the immigration from that town to Canada, to Toronto specifically, more people ended up in Toronto than remained back in the village. This was true of many towns in Calabria. This was part of the great migration of Italians after the Second World War. So between the 50s and 60s, roughly 100,000 Italians arrived in Canada. This was actually the second wave of migration to Canada. There was an earlier one around 1900, but I don't have time to discuss that very much. So I'd like to say that my father immigrated in 1951. So part of the way that families would get to Canada is if there wasn't enough money for everyone to come, the man would come first and then earn enough money to send for the rest of the family. So my father left me when I was a toddler, and I had no memory of him whatsoever. And the next time I saw him was at Union Station in Toronto. And that's where we landed. We left and we went by train to Naples, and I came by ship. And the Atlantic crossing took 12 days at that time. And so we landed at Pier 21 and then took the train to Union Station. And we lived in near King Street for a little while, but not very long. I'll say that, like much of our extended family and the immigrant women from our town, the women all went to work. I came here with 2 siblings. My sister was not yet 16. She was 9 years older than I was, and she was not yet 16, but she went to work in a factory. My mother went to work in a factory about a week after we arrived. And so the big pressure was always to climb for the Italians of that area and that generation was to climb out of poverty as quickly as you could. So we landed here in the spring, and by December, my parents had enough money to make a down payment on a house. And we moved to an Anglo-Saxon neighborhood near Davenport and Spadina. So right where Casa Loma, if you know Toronto, it's where Casa Loma comes down. So this was my setting. Children don't have any say in immigration. They're basically taken from the place where they are and launched into a different history and a different geography. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was not happy about immigrating. I resisted and cried when we left. But anyway, there I was in this Anglo-Saxon neighborhood. And what I experienced very early on was that I was the only Italian kid in my class. There were little Italies in Toronto, and I think if I had grown up with more Italian students around me, I might have had an easier time in some way. But anyway, there I was with a lot of Anglo-Saxons in my class. And I'll say that the neighborhood I lived in also had enclaves of rich people. The gated community of Witchwood Park was very close by. And so I had rich kids as well. And my experience, unfortunately, that stayed with me was a difficult one. For 2 years in grade 4 and 6, I had a teacher that was very mean to me. And I had internalized from him that the reason why he disliked me was my ethnicity. I was definitely not English looking. I had dark hair. I had dark eyes and olive skin, and I was petite and short and cute, but nevertheless very foreign to, I would say, to this teacher at least. And so I had him for grade 4 and 6. And he, on the very first day of school, let me know that he did not like me. So aside from that, I would say that I did experience a class exclusion from the rich kids who would not let me join in some of the group activities. That being said, I will say that my educational experience mostly was good. I had very many fine, kind teachers. My grade 5 teacher was a marvel. She was the opposite. She loved me and I was her little pet, and she encouraged me to write poetry. She bought me a poetry anthology and used to send me to classes to read my poetry to the other kids. So I felt special. So I don't want to give the impression that I only had negative experiences. No, that wasn't the case. However, these two experiences that I did have, one which was based on my working class status, and the other one on my being, quote, a foreign, an immigrant, did stay with me. And I think that as I grew up and went to high school, by the way, I do want to say that I had the word WAP thrown at me more than once up until my early 20s, which was my last memory of it. What happened to me was that basically I wanted to be Canadian. And I was constantly told because of discrimination and more, not just at school, but other places as I grew up, that I was not Canadian. And I was other, that I was Italian, in fact. So I internalized that I was Italian, but I think I internalized it with a kind of self-loathing because I wanted to be Canadian. I want to say that I resented my last name, Riccio, because it had an O on it. When I was in high school at Oakwood Collegiate, I had a friend whose name was Italian. She was Italian. Her name was Bernadette Moscone. And she shortened that to Bernie Moscone because she could make that E silent. And I could not do nothing with my O. So that was another thing that crossed my mind. So I want to say something about the quality of the discrimination. As I said, I was constantly told that I was not Canadian, that I was Italian. And so I had a very strong Italian identity that I carried around with me, which became a kind of self-loathing Italian that I carried around until probably into my 30s. And then I forgot to say that when I enrolled in grade 1, my name was changed from Giovanna to Joan. It was anglicized. And that's what the British feel very comfortable doing as colonizers. They feel very comfortable just changing whatever they want to change. So my name was changed to Joan, but when I decided that I would embrace my Italianicity in my early 40s, and the way I reached that was through literature, specifically the Italian-American Helen Barolini, who was a big influence on me. I decided that I would change my name back to Giovanna. And to me, that was a declaration. Anytime I introduced myself to someone or signed my name, I openly declared the fact that I was Italian and certainly not Canadian. So I want to say as a historical note here that I think the discrimination that was in the air, I want to say that a poll that was taken of Canadians in 1955, the year that I arrived, the year before I arrived, showed that 4.4 of Canadians polled preferred, only 4.4 of Canadians welcomed Italians. And in fact, the majority of people stated that they did not want immigrants from the Mediterranean, specifically Greek and Italians, that they preferred British and Northern Europeans. So that was the kind of atmosphere that I walked into. And I want to say that I think what was happening was a hangover from the internment of the Italians that happened during World War II. And for those of us who don't know this history, for our guests from the East-West Learning Connection, I would like to just give a little bit of background. So in 1940, the Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, who was fascist, entered the war on the side of Germany, along with the Japanese, known as the Axis powers. Of course, Canada entered the war on the side of Britain. And immediately, as soon as that happened, Canada considered itself to be at war with Italy, and citizens of Germany, Japan, and Italy were declared as enemy aliens. And 31,000 Italians at that time were registered as enemy aliens. But I don't think you had to be a citizen of Italy. You just had to be Italian here in Canada to feel the fallout of that action. So as soon as the war was declared, the War Measures Act came into effect, and that gave the government the ability to arrest people, just very much like in the US after 9/11, to arrest people without any charges or any evidence having to be brought against them. And that lasted, so the people who were interned there were about 600 Canadians, 850 Germans, and about 700 Japanese were interned. But a lot of the people that were interned were the leaders of the Italian community, the very successful businessmen. And according to Kenneth Bagnall, practically every doctor that was in Canada that was of Italian heritage was interned. So successful businessmen, people who had some education and were the leaders of the community were interned, along with very many other people who were just workers, the working class, grocers, shoemakers, etc. And one of the reasons that some were interned was that they belonged to Italian organizations, such as their social clubs from their town or the Sons of Italy. But I do say on the side of the government that there were fascist groups in Canada, and the Italian consulate was certainly a fascist center. Benito Mussolini had the idea of empire as part of his vision, and part of his plan was to get Italians that had immigrated to actually join the fascist party, become fascist supporters, and so spread Italian fascism overseas. And so there were parades where Italians were making the fascist salute. Editorials were written by some Italians in newspapers, but two historians, Frank Storino and Kenneth Bagnall, have both mentioned that in their studies and research, most Italians did not support the fascists in any way that was a security threat, that it was more like belonging to a social club if they belonged. And anyway, the internment ended in 1943. And when Mussolini surrendered and all the internees were released that were still being held were released. But what happened with the Italians was that they had they now carried this shame, and they no longer wanted to openly declare their Italian heritage, and many anglicized their names. So Ricci would become Rice, that kind of thing. And it was a leaderless community for a period of time, trying to just put itself back together. And so when my father arrived in 1951, Italians had only been removed from the enemy aliens list for 4 years. They were removed in 1947. So I believe there was a good hangover from this period still in the air in the 1950s. So I grew up, as I say, pretty much as a self-loathing Italian. And then I went to teachers college. The other thing that happened with a lot of Italians was that they were streamed. This is a problem we have that is ongoing in Canada. Right now in Toronto, it's a problem for the African community. Italians were streamed in the educational system in the 1950s and 60s to attend high schools that would not prepare them, that is collegiates. I went to a collegiate, but they were sent to high schools that would prepare them for the trades or for commerce, like secretarial posts. And so basically the trajectory was to keep Italians in the working class. In 1961, when John Porter wrote his classic, The Vertical Mosaic, an analysis of class and power in Canada, he placed Italians at the very bottom of the class structure in Canada, saying that when he did his research, Italians represented the lowest percentage in the professional classes and the highest percentage in unskilled labor. I do want to say that by the 1980s, the Italians had, with the second generation, had recovered from all that, and their percentage of higher education was the same as the Canadian population at large. Now, I've gone over just slightly, but I would like to just say, go back to my own personal story and say that as I did go to teachers college. I did not go to university, and teachers college was a way to enter the professions for many Italians. And so the teaching profession did have a substantial number of Italians in the late 60s and early 70s. And I went to university at night and in the summer. I want to say that I graduated and I studied philosophy and graduated with high distinction. And so I was very proud to achieve that. My brother, on the other hand, dropped out of school in grade 9. He is an example of how the school system failed Italian immigrants. There, you have to remember that multiculturalism was not an official policy in Canada until 1971 with Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And so when we arrived, there were no ESL classes in our neighborhood and no supports for immigrant children. My brother was advised in grade 9 at Central Tech to go and learn a trade, and he became a hairdresser. I want to say that my brother is a very intelligent person, not bookish like me, but he became a hairdresser, quickly got 4 beauty salons, and then decided there wasn't enough money in hair and went into construction and is now a millionaire many times over. And basically, like James Franceschini, does infrastructure contracts for various cities. My sister is exemplary of what happened with Italian women and the oppression that I experienced as a young Italian woman, which was that the family was central. My sister married at 18 and moved to the first suburb, Downsview, and followed the route that she was supposed to follow. I, however, just was a misfit. And I grew up in the 1960s, best generation. So I grew up with the counterculture, the sexual revolution, the peace movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and second wave feminism. And I wasn't having it. So I left home and went to live on a farm and set my hippie soul free. My parents, of course, had left a rural community and were pretty freaked out about that. When I returned to Toronto, I got my own apartment, and I became a leftist. I actually in Teachers College, I developed connections with the left-wing communities of Toronto and embraced radical politics. And so I refused to get married. I lived common law with my first and my partners up to this day. I found the idea of getting married and just having a family and following that route just didn't sit very well with me. And I have to say it did not sit well with my family that I moved out and made these choices. I was a successful teacher. I had a teaching job. When I came back to Toronto, I got one after a few years of sowing my wild oats. I settled down and got a teaching job and was a respectable citizen, but nevertheless, I was still seen as deviant in my family and in my extended family as well. They finally did come around, I have to say, and just accepted that I was different, but that was my experience. And so I know that there were I've met other Italian Canadian women that had similar experiences and just found the family very oppressive. And then there were others of my generation who did they embraced that and loved that. And I have to say, I love Italian culture, and the Italian family is a source of warmth. It just was not what I wanted. And so I just broke free of that and pursued my own goals. And I became a poet as a young child. My father was a gifted writer and orator. He was a self-taught intellectual. And I figured if my father could write poetry, so could I. And I took up public speaking as he did. He was my role model. And I had some wonderful teachers that encouraged me and others that did not. In university, I had a mentor that helped me out quite a bit. And after I retired from teaching, I started publishing poetry, even some under my name, Joan, but I didn't publish any books until I retired and had time. And so I've gone way over my time, but have given you as much of the story as I can fit in here. And hopefully I can squeeze in more history later during our group discussion. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you, Giovanna, to reveal a real self to us. That's very eye-opening. And thank you. So I guess now we're going to Francesco.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you, Yang, for organizing this. It's really a pleasure to see this many people there. I also have to say that I'm glad to be here with Giovanna, whom I've known for some time and actually admire, and with Antonia, whom I met only recently, but whose first book I really liked. So I think perhaps it's okay if I make a plug for that book, read it. As for me, I think for full disclosure, again, I should say that I don't consider myself a writer, at least not in the sense of that we usually attach to this term. I've written mostly academic things and essays, some personal, but that's how I would see myself, more of an essayist rather than a writer. I still have too much respect for writers, perhaps. Okay, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about one of the things that I actually found and still find most interesting about Italian Canadian literature. And that is related to the idea of generation. By this, I don't mean generation in the sense of young versus old, or even in the sense whereby we say the last generation, the generation of the 20s, the generation of the 60s, the generation Y, or generation Z. I mean it in the way that I think applies primarily to migrants. And that is in the sense of first, second, third kind of process. I think after only migrants are caught in that time warp whereby you can peg them and say, I belong here, I belong there, or I belong there. And after a while, of course, this disappears, but it's there. And I think that's my main point of departure. How does this apply to Italian Canadiana? Well, when I first read works by Italian Canadians back in the late 70s, I was at Carleton teaching Italian and comparative literature. My first encounter was with the actual first anthology of Italian Canadian poetry, which is an anthology entitled Roman Candles and edited by Piazzas di Cicco. After I reviewed the book, I organized lectures on Italian Canadian literature. And then I think I was with my colleague, William Anselmi, who is now in Edmonton, the one who organized the first course at the university level on Italian Canadian literature. What struck me and what right now, looking back, I want to bring this notion of generation into play is that when I started reading the poems and then later the novels of that early group of Italian Canadian writers. And by the way, I'm going to primarily talk about them. I know that there's a second generation, third generation, and I know that there were differences between those who wrote in the 70s and those who wrote in the 80s and the 90s and further on. But what I want to say, it has to do primarily with what those writers emphasize more than anybody else. The thing that I noticed right away is the presence of portraits of older parents, friends, uncles, and I thought for a while that this wasn't important, but as I started looking at Italian-Canadian more carefully, actually this became quite a central issue for me now, and I certainly think that it deserves some attention. I think the writers were paying homage to the people with whom they've had to separate themselves, father, mothers, uncles, maybe even friends, but older friends, if they were friends. They had to separate themselves from to actually become what they became, to actually become writers. The process by which Italian Canadians writers at that point, which did become writers, was by leaving home and by sort of putting on hold whatever relationship they might have had with their parents. Now, the other thing that struck me right away was that, of course, these people that were represented were not themselves cultured, were not themselves even, in some cases, literate. So that they were people who actually weren't at ease with words. They were actually, as an Italian-Canadian writer from Montreal called them, they were gens du silence, is people who were more in touch with silence than with words. They're those people who maybe would like to say things, but don't. There is actually a poem by Mary Di Michele that I thought about in thinking about what I would say here. And it is a very, very interesting poem, one in which the father who has looked at her poems talks with her, and at a certain point says, I'm a worker and didn't go to school, but I would have liked to be an educated man, to think great thoughts, to write them and have somebody listen. As I said, there were a lot of, there was a lot of silence in these people. And I thought that this, again, was very important because it was something from which the writers had to detach themselves. They did so in different way. For example, there is another writer, let's see if I have the book here, who actually is one of the writers that I think hit the matter on the ball. I'm going to read just a couple of stanzas here. My father forgives me everything. The senseless universities that did not make things any better at all. My vague Canadian pain, even my Protestant friends ashamed of their money. He has forgiven Canada for his old age. He has forgotten the war-crazy rich who took him from his family, 12 years in blasted foreign countries, wars he did not understand. And he still goes to mass every day and still prays for those who ended up alone. But the important thing is what he says later on. Poetry at best leaves me cold. My father suffered more indignities than words could ever dream of conjuring. I should leave poems and this language, and I should blow up all the subdivisions he carried cement for. he did not build my prison. I cannot raise all these countries, Father. I'm sorry for these songs. So this is Saro D'Agostino from Toronto, who was writing again in the 70s. I think this is the extreme point. Even though he didn't publish much, it's an extreme moment in Italian-Canadian literature, where the silence sort of takes over even the children. But the children, again, are the ones who write. And in writing, in order to write, again, they had to go through a certain process, the process whereby you become a coach, the process of whereby you go to school, go to university, anglicize yourself, give yourself the words by which you're going to speak about those people who don't speak. And that is the thing that I found most interesting. This homage that they paid to people who just didn't have the words, and it was their role, in a sense, to say the words for them. They were the ones who were actually the porte-parole, as they say in French, of their relatives. Now, the thing that interested me also was later on when I started thinking about this, is that this was also something that I had gone through. And I and my family arrived in Vancouver in the mid-1950s. The writers that I speak of were all born between 1945 and probably 1955. They were younger than I was, but there is some generational link there. But when I arrived in Vancouver after going through the New Canadian class, I ended up in grade 7, grade 8. I was almost 12 when I arrived there. And of course, I right away noticed the kind of loneliness that as an immigrant you run into. In the class, there were Germans, Finnish, Chinese, Japanese, a lot of Chinese and a lot of Japanese. With them, we sort of sympathized, but we were all separate. We all kept to each other. We were many solitudes. I think as a book by Linda entitled Other Solitudes, we were the other solitudes. I started to, of course, think about going to university, and I did go to university. But in going to university, I suddenly realized that the people with whom I had hung out, the young people with whom I hung out and played soccer with, I played a lot of soccer in my teens up to my 20s, early 20s, suddenly sort of kept their distance. Even my relatives really, I think, admired me, but they were very careful. For them, I was il professore, and you don't try to talk in families like ours to a professore. You try to just say what you need and leave it there. I graduated from UBC with a BA in English and minors in French and Italian, but already there, I had realized that I was going through a kind of second migration. I had already few ties with the Italian community. My parents, of course, again, supported me, et cetera, but even from them, there was things that were with them. There were things that weren't actually going as they should have. All of this again made me think about migration and made me really look for writers who dealt with this topic. And it's at that time that I found them primarily in Italian literature. And the two things, the sense of being an immigrant and the reading also Italian literature, which I didn't know about until then, brought me to UCLA, where I had a scholarship, and I began the PhD program in Italian. So in a sense, in my case, it's the migration ended up with the opposite of what those people about whom the writers were talking were able to do. I acquired language through this sense of also being some way separate from the culture in which I grew up, and for which I had to compensate. And I did compensate again through the study of Italian. What could I say about this? There is when I started reading these writers, of course, a lot of empathy with them. I associated with them, and despite the objectivity that text required, there was quite of an emotional element there, and basically it has stayed there. This is, I think, the thing that really ties me to Italian-Canadian writers. Italian-Canadian writers had, like me, had to go away to become writers. But as they became writers, they went the other way. They had to somehow rethink their origins, their background, and this is why there is in their early writings, in those writers that I'm talking about, these photographs, so to speak, of their uncles, parents, friends. I think, right, of course, when I look back, this is a phase, of course, even though I think that first generation writers of, let's say, the 90s or the 21st century go through the same process. Now, of course, their parents may not be as wordless, as uneducated as ours were, but there is always some break that has to happen in order for the literature to occur. So in a sense, I see this myself in the light of what these writers were doing, and I see myself in a sense of talking about something that is about myself, but talking about them and about myself at a kind of meta level, as somebody who now can think about these things and maybe even parlay them in ways that perhaps people don't think about. I certainly think that Italian-Canadian literature is a literature that can stand comparison with the best. I myself have tried, for example, point out to my colleagues that, you know, James Joyce in Ulysses was doing a lot of the things that I think Italian-Canadian writers are doing. You can go back to the Bible, you can go back to Greece, you know, Homer and the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Telemachus is the one who searches for the father, and basically, so in one sense, I feel myself to be like the writers, but then I see myself also as somebody who can allow them to circulate as they should be. And I'm going to stop here because I think I've spoken enough, but later on, if there is a discussion, there are a couple of things that I would like to add. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Francesco. I think you're the owner of your solitude. You keep a distance that might give you a good stand to do those literature critics. Thank you. Now we'll move on to Antonia. Antonia.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Yang, for organizing tonight. And thank you to the East West for hosting this. And thank you to Giovanna and Francesco for such great talks to start us off with. I've been taking notes as we're going along. So it's been a good evening so far. My name is Antonia, and I'm the third generation speaker tonight. My grandparents came from Italy to Canada in the 1960s in the post-World War II wave. My dad's side came from Rapalmuto and my mom's side came from Novelli. So two very small towns in Italy. My parents were born here in Canada, and I was born here as well at the end of the 20th century. And I grew up in a time when it was considered cool to be Italian, and I want to talk a little bit about what that phrase, cool to be Italian, really means. Most simply, it refers to, I guess, a common opinion that obtaining or invoking or performing Italian customs and symbols is a stylish practice and a stylish thing to do. But as Giovanna and Francesco explained earlier, it wasn't always cool to be Italian in Canada. I'm not, an expert on the assimilation and integration of Italian customs in North America, but there's no doubt that the Italians acquired quite a snazzy presence here. By the time I was growing up in the late 90s and the early 2000s, Italian culture was well integrated into North American pop culture. Just looking back to my childhood, I remember how everyone loved wearing that blue soccer jersey for Team Italia, and everyone loved pizza and spaghetti, and my gosh, the Godfather trilogy was insanely popular, and we played Mafia at recess. It was a game we played just among ourselves. And since Italianness was this fashionable thing to strut, I didn't resist my cultural identity as a child. I very much embraced it, and I very naively saw myself as, simply Italian and Canadian, able to partake in and celebrate both cultures without fully realizing how they interacted with one another, or how different immigrant groups, oh my gosh, affect dominant Canadian cultures. Essentially, growing up when it was cool to be Italian actually stunted my own reflection on and exploration of my community's heritage. Looking back, I'm able to see how pop culture Italianness oversimplified the culturally charged experiences that formed my identity as a child, most notably my relationship to language. my parents chose not to teach me Italian when I was younger because they were worried I wouldn't be able to speak English as well as the other children. And, you know, a few everyday words were passed down to me, like nonna and nonno, or zia and zio. But I'm in no way fluent, and I honestly sometimes question my own pronunciation of my last name, Facciponte, even though, you know, I invoke the correct pronunciation of vowels and consonants, and, you know, I place the stresses on the syllables in the correct way. The name sounds different in my mouth than it does in that of my grandparents. And as I grew older, I noticed that my lack of a language, Italian language, caused a disconnection with my grandparents. Dialogue between us was always very direct, and, you know, ideas were simplified, because while my grandparents could speak and read both English and Italian, the latter language always offered them more ease in expression. And they'd often ask, when are you going to learn Italian? You know, that question is burned into my mind. And I realized over time that my grandparents were worried about their language being lost in my generation. But at times I also began to resent the question a bit, mostly because I was exhausted by this implication that I wasn't Italian enough for my family. And I thought I had to rediscover Italy, the old world, to be more complete. My generation actually often internalizes a romanticized portrait of Italian families, viewing the nonna and nonno figures as these endearing golden age heroes adept at cooking and gardening. Though this risks covering up the histories of Italian Canadians, you know, that criminalization and discrimination that Giovanna talked about a bit earlier, as well as those interfamily tensions that arise from or are intensified by diaspora. And in my undergraduate days, I finally started to explore my Italian Canadian identity, not as, you know, heritage with a capital H, but rather as a culture with a hyphen, you know, as an evolving experience where both languages and both customs were in tension, you know, interacting in an attempt to establish some sort of equilibrium. And essentially, I wanted to better understand what the label Italian Canadian meant to me. And this happened mostly through, you know, cooking and reading and writing. So to start with cooking, you know, the big family feast is a hallmark of Italian stereotypes. And this familiar image began to strike me as very odd, not only because it's so superficial, but also because it overlapped quite a bit with my own identity. You know, I do love things like pasta and cannoli. You know, that's just part of who I am, but I wondered how I could draft Italian cuisine as part of my identity without falling into those cinematic cliches surrounding it. And I decided to put eating aside and focus more on the process of cooking. I always watched my grandmothers cook, but I began to center my attention less on the meal itself and more on how they maneuvered their bodies around the kitchen. You know, I detected moments of exhaustion or frustration, back hunched, elbows leaning into the sink to peel and wash beans, or, you know, dropping a single ravioli and then flinging it back into the pot, hoping that nobody noticed. And as a result, to explore this further, I ended up writing quite a few poems about my community's cuisine, not as this abstract concept constructed upon idealizations, but rather as a lived reality, a daily drama of successes and failures. That said, rediscovering food wasn't enough to totally override the romanticized image of Italians in North American pop culture. While my grandparents are forever willing to share secrets about cooking or gardening, they aren't as vocal about hardships. And, you know, it's no news that the Italian Canadian culture often internalizes a tendency to idealize, like through, you know, all those social clubs centered around cultural nostalgia, which I've had quite a bit of fun at, I'll add as well. And you know, this internalized tendency to idealize is to an extent understandable. Immigrating at a time when political correctness wasn't a social norm, my grandparents were left to guard their own identity in a way. Though the resulting effects in my generation is this: family truths are doled out in bits and pieces, and personal tragedies are reduced to brief utterances across a table. Grandchildren are left with a fragmentary understanding of their community's history and with the inauthentic images of pop culture to embrace. Now, Italian-Canadian authors offered me a gateway into exploring this community's history. This body of literature is more than just an archive of dates and places, or you know, common cultural symbols like Pier 21 or College Street or Little Italy. And I think Elena Piazza wrote it really well, writing, quote, "While the historian recorded the factual documentary story, the creative artistic world began to record the emotional experience," end quote. I would add that the artistic world doesn't simply augment, but also alters the historical narrative, you know, often blurring together fiction and autobiography. Many of these authors present Italianness translated into Canada as a lived experience. And one of my favorite examples of this is Gianna Patriarca's poem, College Street, Toronto, because the poem not only alludes to the gentrification of Little Italy, it also complicates this historical image by inviting us to contemplate which groups are permitted to enter certain spaces in the city and by extension are permitted to belong. And it's literatures like these that provide a cultural backdrop for the fragmentary stories of my family. And these literatures have actually motivated me quite a bit to be more persistent in asking my nonas to tell me stories. You know, I now nudge them a bit more to draft and articulate a fuller story for me. And I don't pose reading and storytelling as a way to archive the past. And various authors have, you know, either commented on or written about the dangers of merely preserving cultural histories and symbols. Mary Di Michele and Carmine Starnino come to mind here. But as a poet, I try best to understand my identity not as past Italianness reincarnated, but rather as an independent dynamic form in and of itself. My first poetry collection employs the image of a bridge as a metaphor for moving between generations and for translating past cultural customs and stories into the present generation. Several poems I've written explore how regional dialects and practices mix together in my everyday speech and habits, you know, to the point where I can't always tell if a word or a custom or a concept is Navarrese, Sicilian, or, you know, just Italian. And I focus much of my writing on how my speech has anglicized Italian words, like my last name, or, you know, just little words here and there. When I finally saw myself as an active agent, not only practicing, but also reshaping my family's cultural customs, I recognized that my identity as an Italian Canadian was inherently linked to the community's flexibility and fluidity and mutability. This panel's subtitle, On Italians Becoming Canadians, really interested me. I think it's a very intriguing one because we can understand this process of becoming to refer to matters of assimilation and integration, but we can also understand Italians becoming Canadians as this ongoing process whereby customs and practices are plastic forms in everyday life. There's a quote from Carmine Starnino that really resonates here, talking about our community's ethnicity. It can be seen, quote, as a riddle that exceeds interpretation, a sense of self always looking for a larger framework to join, end quote. I want to emphasize that labels such as Italian Canadian or Italian Canadian author shouldn't necessarily isolate one culture from another, but rather draw attention to emotional and historical experiences that extend beyond a single group. And I mean, some of the most satisfying feedback I've ever received on my writing came from those who weren't Italian Canadian, because it illuminated so much of what I'm trying to do. And that is defamiliarize my own identity and culture in order to move within, around, and then beyond the labels that define us, ultimately as a way of empathizing with others. So I've talked for quite a bit now. Thank you so much for listening and for being so patient as I got through all that.
Well, thank you very much, Antonia. I admire your reflective thinking and pursuit of this dynamic growth as an individual, absorbing all elements and nutrition from both cultures, but grow as a very independent individual. Thank you very much. That's inspirational.
Thank you.
And I know you three would like to have a discussion with each other, right? Giovanna?
My inclination is that it's 10 after 8.
Is it?
I'm just wondering what the other two think.
Well, we can say a few things, Giovanna, and then maybe 5 minutes. I'd like to say something about Antonia's, what Antonia said.
Yes.
I read her book and I was very impressed. I know that there is a chapter in l'arte culinaria, she called it. And I was, what impressed me most was the lightness of touch with which she approached the Italian Canadian mores. And I think she's right in what she has said. The Italian Canadian now can look at themselves as being in some way not only part of this country, but fashionable. But for me, what is important here is that the people who made this possible were not us educated people, but were actually the people who weren't able to talk, weren't able to do it. And they did so not only by putting culinary aspects of Italian culture in the forefront. They actually changed the language of Canada, because now we talk about gelato, rapini, pasta, the vocabulary that in the last 30 years of Italian vocabulary that has appeared in the general language is actually quite impressive. The language of cooking has replaced the language of music as the presence of Italian in international international languages, particularly in English. So I think in some way it's much easier to talk about Italian Canadian now. And as I said, you do it marvelously with that, I think, lightness of touch, which I really was impressed with.
Okay, I'd like to say a few things. Speaking about the generational idea, and also about writing as an act, as Francesco was talking about, one where you actually have to separate yourself, and it's another type of migration from the family. As I said, I actually did leave the family physically, although of course I went to visit my mother my father died when I was 25, and I certainly went to visit my mother every week. And when I moved out, I lived very close to her in order to look after her, although I did not want to live with her. But in my poetry, in my first collection, Strong Bread, which has a chunk of poems, as Francesco was describing about growing up as an immigrant and the family, including portraits of my aunt and my parents, my sister, who was quite a bit older than I. The separation was one where I wanted to be able to critique, not only to express the bravery and the resilience that the Italians had, and the fact that they were able to express the potential that Italy failed to give them in their own country by their own hard work, the success that they had here, the success that their children had after them. I wanted to capture that, but I also wanted to capture the heartbreak. So I wrote a very long poem about my father called Vittorio. I wrote it as a dramatic monologue in his voice. And what I wanted to depict in that was how I felt my father's fragmentation here through his loss of language and status. So my father was a man with a voice. Most of my uncles were what Francesco described, silent types. But my father was a public speaker. He was a piazza personality. In Italy, for instance, after the Second World War, when the Republic referendum was being taken, my father was a speaker who went from town to town speaking in favor of the Republic and getting rid of the king. So my experience was not of silence, but of ability to articulate. And what I picked up from my father's was he was greatly admired in our community. He was asked to speak at weddings. He was asked to speak at political dues. He was admired for his beauty of language, through his being self-taught mostly, and also for his ability to speak. So I had a different experience. But my father, what I noticed, he had another condition, and that was his fragmentation. What I saw was a person who was trying to piece together his dignity by his activity in the community, and to regain his sense of having a place. And that was what I wrote about. But the other thing I wanted to write about was the oppression that I felt in the Italian family. The way that women were like Gianna, the way that women were codified into certain roles and forced to stay there, as well as family violence. I had no family violence, but my mother, was raised in Italy with a father who was very hardworking and very accomplished. He went back and forth to the United States to make money, and he was very accomplished in land acquisition. But he was very harsh. And when I wrote a poem about his physicality with my mother, she told me, "You should not have written that." And I told her, my job is to tell the truth. And that, I think, is the job of writers. One of the jobs of writers, one of the work that we do is to tell the truth. And the other thing that I wanted to capture was the tension between generations, the tension between myself and the parental generation, and also the tension between myself and the dominant culture in the discrimination I had grown up with. And so I think Francesco is absolutely right. You have to give yourself permission to separate yourself through your work in order to tell this truth that you want to tell through your work. But it's also important, as Antonia mentioned, as a kind of record, not a historical archive, but a record of the emotional life of the community, as well as the actual life of the community. So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Giovanna, I think you're right. The Italian-Canadian experience has to be genderized, of course. I think you mentioned Gianna Patriarch, but yourself, other writers too. I think in my own family, when we arrived, I had two sisters. I have now only one sister because the other one passed away. But when we arrived, my older sister, who was 17 at that time, after 2 weeks, she was already in a factory working.
Right.
My younger sister went up to high school, found an office job, and was never encouraged to go on. So there is certainly that element. I think also when I look back at the many proxy marriages, which is something that generally isn't discussed. But I mean, I had cousins who married people whom they had seen only in photographs and didn't know if they were tall, short, or, you know, in a sense. So yeah, that is something that has to be talked about.
Yeah.
If I could jump in here for a minute, I think what I'm aware of, and I'm sort of in a situation with, I grew up in Winnipeg, which is isolated from the major immigration centers of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So therefore, the experience is a little more nuanced. And I also, in my own reflections, have felt that, first of all, what Francesco was saying is absolutely bang on. And I think that there's this funny two-step dance that you do, that you separate yourself from your culture so that you can look at it, talk about it, and at the same time, look at its warts as well as its wonders, which its wonders, of course, is a form of homage to their experience. And I think you're ingrained from, at least I was from an early age, to be respectful. So you try to be respectful to the experience of your immediate family and aunts and uncles and stuff. But at the same time, there's lots of warts there, and I think that's what Giovanna's talking about. There is a lot of, and those warts are multi-layered. They're not just I think they would have existed even in Italy. Is my point. The clashes, the view of how women's place is in a family and in society would have existed independently of whether they lived in Canada or not. I think that was part of, to give you a broad stroke, part of the Southern Italian way of looking at the world, and perhaps even the Northern, although that changed over time. And I think that's another thing too. I've been to Italy back and forth, and I think Southern culture is very distinct from Northern culture, and that's why I found this whole, I'm now much older, but when I was growing up, it was neither here nor there that if you were cool being Italian. And I have to say, unlike Giovanna, I didn't really feel a weight of oppression or racism. It was kind of, being Italian was just kind of like, the cliche was that we were all happy, like, and that we all ate pasta. And I used to have friends come over, and they would ask my sisters to go in the fridge and take out mortadella out of the fridge so they could eat mortadella sandwiches with. They were totally fascinated with Italian food, but it was not a hip thing to do. It was just people I found people just bought into the notion that Italian food was fun and it was good. This whole cool thing, it just, to me, is such a whitewash. I actually in many ways resented it, even though I suppose one could parlay that into some form of identity advantage. But the thing that really bothers me is that other Italians participate in it. It's not just, for lack of a better word, the Anglo-Saxon cultures that promote this notion of being Italian cool, but Italians themselves, who, again, I don't even think it exists in Italy. It's a very unusual phenomenon. I'm not really sure how to get my head around it. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think that some of the issues that have been raised here would have been issues regardless of whether you lived in Canada or not.
Actually, I disagree. I actually disagree. But I do entirely disagree. But let me just bring in this. Okay.
I'm glad actually you disagree. I don't like to be right on.
Let me make this one point, because having gone back to my hometown, which I love, I go back. I try to go back every time I visit Italy, which is frequently. But growing up here, especially where I grew up in an Anglo-Saxon neighborhood where I had no real Italian friends, I saw other ways of living. I saw young women who dated. I saw young women who were free, who had all manner of choices that I did not have. My brother was free to date and go out. I had to come home and be chaste and learn how to cook and all that and iron. So in a small town is a contained community. So perhaps once the intervention of television came in, that exposure was there. And I do agree with Carmelo in this sense that there are always generational tensions. There are always generational tensions somehow or other. But I would certainly say that the exposure for my generation, if I had stayed in that small town rather than immigrating here, unless I had been sent away to school, I probably would not have seen all the options that I saw here, plus to be exposed to the history that was happening around me politically in terms of gender and culture. So that's what I have to say. I just want to see if Antonia has anything to pipe in about. Antonia, do you want to make a comment?
Honestly, I think yours is a good note to end on. I also see it's almost 8:30, so.
Okay, yeah, and we want to have time for Antonia to read a poem and me to read a poem, and then we'll open it up to comments from the audience. And so Antonia, you want to read a poem or two?
Yes, I'm gonna read from To Make a Bridge.
A great book.
Thank you. I'm going to read the title poem. And for those who might not notice, To Make a Bridge is a loose translation of my last name, Facciponte. This poem is dedicated to my two nonnas. A letter like an overpass that touches both history and posterity, asks we prick up ears, learn patience in the present while waiting for the past to answer on paper. Poems are sideways viaducts that versify buried stories into arching alphabets, sentencing words into roads of imagined images. But while I craft mouthfuls of ink, you spell out another bridge, precious plates of penne, heart-raving ravioli, all smothered with the sugo you schooled me to craft. Do you see how you guide my emerging hand? I never traversed an ocean, though I ache to translate your teachings. Bridge making isn't a rigid refrain for traveling from A to B, but an act of creation that ushers us across time and in between stories, an act of navigating, exploring the bearings that bind each to the other. And I'll just note that I had actually sent an earlier draft of this poem to Giovanna, and she provided some very helpful editing advice. I think it was last year, perhaps, that we talked about it. I have a second poem prepared, but maybe we should just move on to keep things going.
You can read a second poem, read it.
Okay. This one is called Mouthful, and it's a poem I wrote trying to describe the pronunciation of my last name, which I'll just repeat again, is Facciponte, just because it makes listening to the poem a little bit easier. How do you say it? Stressing the fa, darting down in pitch, attacking the next syllable, the harsh chiseled ch of the chi. It's not a soft C and doesn't slide off the tongue. Lipping the noise forward, the pon bursts through, the syllable more surreal with repetition. Pon, pon, pond. The shard te peeps like a bell. Nonna claims that E was once an I before she and Nonno crossed the border. Gagging on enunciation, I fumble to hear my lips. Thank you for listening and for being patient as I read those.
Wonderful poetry. Wonderful, thank you. I am so proud of you. I'm going to read a poem called Nice Italian Girl. So this is an ironic title. I used to be part of a co-organizer of a reading series called Not So Nice Italian Girls. but it came out of a series called Nice Italian Girls, and I wrote this poem. So College Street is the center of Little Italy, one of the Little Italies in Toronto. Evening on Old College Street. The sun sets, cafes fill up with nice Italian girls who drive new cars and wear designer clothes. Each one weighed down by a rustling train, so faint, so faded, the girls themselves forget that before suburbs, before arching monster homes, ships carrying the poor in their hold, ocean-going ships bringing mute Italian girls to the factories. An army of them, pliant, dressed in black, dark hair curling in their armpits, mysterious, industrious, but nice, with the smell of work about them. Standing exhausted in crowded streetcars, trapped inside sweatshops, inhaling plastics and lead, forever nice to their husbands every night, mouthing hushed songs to daughters who marry young and buy ornate bedroom suites to soothe the worn voices, who buy lacy quiescence in lingerie boutiques and press themselves into imported sheets and pillowcases, who bury their souls in the weave of bleached linen. And I'd like to read now one of those poems that Francesco was talking about, a portrait poem of the other generation. This is written for my aunt, who was a second mother to me and stayed in Italy, never came. And when I learned of her death, I wrote this elegy. It's called Elegy with Oranges. From my displaced childhood, you come eating oranges. Then again at 24, welcoming me home. I see you where I left you, waving at the top of the climb where you have always been. You stayed in place, washed love's calloused feet, a father sick from bullying life, the husband they gave you at 15. Honey, figs, tomatoes, olives saved each season, a good name preserved in that dialect where duty nods and smiles. Zia, what did you swallow for 7 decades to throw up so much blood? Small as a child, your children said, words that rifled the safety distance keeps. Some faraway thought picked an orange. I rip away thick skin, my hands sticky with the blood aroma of orchards where women harden to a petrified beauty. Is your thin face folded into the stone now, Zia? In a heaven where God is a woman with artful step and a rag halo to buffer her head from the mountain villages she carries? Though your name stings like sudden nettles, I can love you unafraid again. There in your kitchen, tall, framed by my 6-year-old eyes, you raise a morning of warm light and fresh bread. You call a hungry world to come up and eat. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we not only got to hear all the discussions, but I got to enjoy these wonderful poems. Thank you. Yeah. So I think we will open floor for our audience to ask questions or share their thoughts.